August 2018, Miyagi Prefecture, Japan. A 10-year-old boy vanished from an elementary school, and suspicion immediately fell on the last person seen with him, a Filipino English teacher named Silea Santiago. Police questioned her. Parents accused her. Her career hung by a thread. But instead of simply defending herself, this teacher made a choice that would put her own safety at risk to uncover a truth far darker than anyone suspected. This is the story of a foreign educator who refused to look away when a child needed help. In 2018, Silea Santiago was living what many would consider a dream. Working as an English teacher in Japan through a prestigious teaching exchange program. At 29 years old, she'd left her position at a public school in Pampanga, Philippines for this opportunity, dedicating months to mastering Japanese language and cultural protocols before her placement. The elementary school in Miyagi Prefecture, in Japan's Tohoku region, embodied everything foreigners imagine about Japanese education: discipline, order, respect, and academic excellence. For Leia, it represented professional advancement and cultural immersion. She approached her role with enthusiasm, connecting with students and colleagues, though not everyone welcomed her presence. Miss Yamada, the head teacher overseeing the elementary grade levels, maintained notably cold distance from foreign staff, particularly toward Leia. This dynamic wasn't uncommon. Japan's educational system, while internationally respected, can be insular, with some educators viewing foreign teachers as temporary novelties rather than genuine colleagues. Despite this social friction, Leia developed meaningful relationships with her students. One boy in particular caught her attention: Kento Miyazaki, a 10-year-old who stood out in concerning ways. Academically, Kento excelled. He arrived early, participated actively, completed assignments meticulously, and demonstrated intelligence beyond his years. But socially, he remained isolated, rarely playing with classmates, avoiding group activities, and seeming perpetually alone during breaks. What truly alarmed Leia were subtler observations that accumulated over weeks. Kento's startled reactions whenever adult men passed in the hallways, as though expecting confrontation. Bruises on his arms that he carefully concealed beneath his red jacket, even on warm days. His tendency to linger after school, seemingly reluctant to go home, finding excuses to remain in the building until staff insisted he leave. In Japanese culture, where indirect communication is valued and personal matters are rarely discussed openly, these signs might be dismissed or attributed to normal childhood experiences. Teachers are trained to respect family privacy and avoid intrusive questions. But Leia, coming from a different cultural framework and perhaps seeing the situation through an outsider's clearer lens, recognized these patterns as potential indicators of abuse. She didn't immediately confront the situation. Cross-cultural professional boundaries required caution. Accusations of family problems could create diplomatic incidents, damage her career, and potentially harm Kento further if she was wrong. Instead, she observed, documented mentally, and waited for clearer evidence or an opening to help. That opening came tragically on August 22, 2018, a Wednesday that began routinely but would transform into a crisis affecting everyone at the school. After classes ended, Leia encountered Kento in the hallway. They spoke briefly, a normal interaction between teacher and student. She offered some guidance or encouragement, the kind of everyday exchange that happens hundreds of times daily in schools worldwide. Kento left. Leia finished organizing materials in her classroom and departed for her residence. The following morning, Kento didn't arrive at school. Initial absence wasn't alarming. Students get sick. Families have emergencies. Communication sometimes gets missed. But by afternoon, when the school received notification that Kento hadn't returned home the previous night, and his whereabouts remained unknown. Concern escalated into crisis. A missing child triggers immediate institutional response in Japan, where child safety is paramount and disappearances, while rare, generate intense community reaction. The school administration convened emergency meetings, contacted parents, and coordinated with local authorities. In these initial chaotic hours, as everyone scrambled to understand what had happened, suspicion began coalescing around one person, the foreign teacher who'd been the last to see Kento before his disappearance. By the second day of Kento's absence, the school administration took formal action. The principal contacted Kento's father, Mr. Yokota Miyazaki, who reportedly expressed profound concern about his son's disappearance. He referenced the troubling reality that their region had experienced several cases of missing children in recent years, a fact that amplified everyone's anxiety about Kento's safety. During this conversation, Miss Yamada, the head teacher who'd maintained cold distance from Leia, made what would become a pivotal statement. She informed Mr. Miyazaki that the last person seen with his son was Celaya Santiago, the Filipino English teacher who had developed the closest relationship with Kento. This information, delivered in a context of fear and uncertainty, transformed Leia from concerned educator into prime suspect. Mr. Miyazaki immediately accused her of involvement in his son's disappearance, demanding police investigate her thoroughly. Within hours, Leia received a summons for what Japanese authorities call joshu, routine questioning. The term sounds benign, but the experience was anything but routine. From the moment she entered the police station, Leia sensed she wasn't being treated as a witness providing helpful information, but as a suspect whose every word would be scrutinized for inconsistencies. The interrogation focused on her final interaction with Kento. According to witness statements, specifically a parent who'd been picking up their own child, Leia and Kento had been seen walking together toward the school gate around 4 p.m., when students typically departed. Leia confirmed this was accurate. After ensuring her classroom was properly organized, she'd walked out simultaneously with Kento, a coincidence that now appeared sinister under investigative scrutiny. She couldn't explain why this ordinary moment had become suspicious. She'd done nothing wrong, yet the questions implied guilt. Why were you alone with him? What did you discuss? Where did he go after leaving you? Why didn't you ensure he reached home safely? Police confiscated her class journal, mobile phone and bag, searching for evidence. They found nothing incriminating, no suspicious communications, no concerning notes, no indication of improper conduct. Yet they didn't clear her. Instead, she remained listed as a person of interest, a legal limbo where she wasn't formally charged, but remained under investigation. The school administration responded by temporarily suspending her from teaching duties, pending investigation resolution. This action, while presented as procedural necessity, carried implicit accusation. If she were truly innocent, why remove her from the classroom? For Leia, this period was psychologically devastating. She'd come to Japan pursuing professional growth and cultural exchange. Now she faced potential criminal charges in a foreign country, separated from family support systems, navigating legal processes in a language she'd only recently learned, and bearing the weight of community suspicion. Many people in her situation would have become paralyzed by fear, focused entirely on self-protection, perhaps contacting her embassy for assistance in leaving the country. Leia made a different choice. If authorities wouldn't believe her innocence, she would prove it by finding Kento herself. She began conducting her own investigation, using the one advantage she possessed: genuine relationship with the students. While police questioned parents and school administrators, Leia spoke quietly with Kento's classmates, approaching them as the trusted teacher they knew, rather than as a suspect defending herself. One student mentioned seeing Kento crying in the bathroom weeks earlier. The boy had bruises on his arms and was on his phone, from which the student heard a man's voice, shouting, angry, frightening. The student hadn't reported this at the time because, in their child's understanding, it seemed like a private family matter not requiring adult intervention. Another classmate, a girl named Mori, who was initially hesitant to speak, eventually shared that Kento sometimes skipped lunch, claiming he wasn't hungry. She'd occasionally seen him sleeping on a bench in a nearby park before school started, as though he'd spent the night outdoors rather than at home. These testimonies painted a disturbing picture that adults had apparently missed or ignored. A child systematically avoiding home, bearing physical marks of violence, exhibiting behavioral signs of distress. The question wasn't why Kento had disappeared. It was why it had taken his disappearance for anyone to investigate what he was fleeing. Armed with information from Kento's classmates, Leia began piecing together a map of his hidden world, the places where a frightened child might seek refuge. She started with the park Mori had mentioned, a small playground near railroad tracks, not far from the school but isolated enough that a child could hide unnoticed. The park was neglected, the kind of public space that communities forget about. Broken equipment, overgrown grass, the atmosphere of abandonment. Searching the area, Leia discovered something crucial behind a damaged bench. A notebook, its pages water-damaged from dew and rain, but partially legible. Inside were drawings that immediately struck her as unusual. One depicted a child with a woman, both floating above clouds, the kind of idealized imagery that might represent escape or loss. Other pages contained aggressive scribbles, dark marks pressed hard into paper, the visual equivalent of screaming. These weren't typical childhood drawings, they were emotional documents, a child processing trauma through the only medium available. When Leia checked the notebook's cover, she confirmed what she'd suspected. It belonged to Kento. This discovery validated her investigative approach but also deepened her concern. The notebook's location suggested Kento had been coming to this park regularly, perhaps sleeping here as Mori had indicated, using it as sanctuary from whatever he was experiencing at home. Leia faced a critical decision. Should she immediately turn this evidence over to police, demonstrating cooperation and potentially clearing her name? Or should she continue her independent search, believing she could reach Kento in ways authorities couldn't? She chose the latter, reasoning that if Kento was hiding deliberately, seeing police or his father would drive him further underground. But a familiar teacher, someone he trusted, might convince him to accept help. This decision carried enormous risk. If discovered, it would appear she was obstructing investigation or even concealing evidence. As August 25th arrived, 3 days since Kento's disappearance, the search intensified. Local residents joined the effort, canvassing neighborhoods, posting flyers, checking locations where missing children had previously been found. The community response reflected genuine concern, but also the darker reality that cases like this sometimes ended tragically. Carrying Kento's notebook, Leia systematically visited locations students had mentioned. An old basketball court several blocks from school where Kento had been seen alone. A small footbridge where he'd sometimes lingered after classes. And finally, an abandoned bicycle shop that had been damaged by fire 2 years earlier and never repaired. On the evening of the 25th, as rain began falling and streets emptied, Leia approached the bicycle shop with only a small flashlight. The building was structurally compromised, potentially dangerous. Certainly not a place anyone should enter alone at night. But she'd exhausted other options and felt time running out. Behind the shop, beneath a partially collapsed roof that still provided minimal shelter, she found him. Kento sat on wet cardboard, knees pulled to his chest, shivering violently. His clothing was soaked through, his skin pale from exposure and probable hypothermia. Beside him lay his backpack and a small piece of bread wrapped in plastic, though rain had penetrated even that meager protection. Leia's immediate reaction combined relief at finding him alive with alarm at his physical condition. 3 days exposed to weather without adequate food, water, or warmth could cause serious medical complications, particularly for a child. She approached carefully, removing her coat to wrap around him. Kento's initial response was fear. He jerked away, started to run. But when Leia spoke, when he recognized her voice and realized this wasn't his father or police coming to force him home, he stopped. She offered food and juice from her bag, which he accepted with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been rationing insufficient supplies. Over the following hour, sheltering from rain in that abandoned building, Kento gradually explained why he'd run. His account revealed what Leia had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Systematic abuse at home. Violence that had escalated since his mother's death approximately a year earlier. In that abandoned bicycle shop, with rain drumming on the damaged roof, 10-year-old Kento unburdened himself of secrets he'd carried alone for too long. His father, Mr. Yokota Miyazaki, had always been volatile. But after Kento's mother passed away a year earlier, the violence had intensified from occasional outbursts to regular abuse. The physical harm, bruises, welts, injuries Kento concealed beneath long sleeves and careful explanations, represented only part of his suffering. The psychological abuse cut deeper and proved harder to hide from. Mr. Miyazaki repeatedly told Kento something that devastated the child. That he wasn't actually his son. That he was the product of his mother's affair with another man. That his existence was a constant reminder of betrayal. For a 10-year-old trying to process his mother's death while simultaneously being told he was the illegitimate offspring of her infidelity, the psychological damage was profound. Kento loved his father despite everything, yearned for acceptance and affection, yet received only rejection and accusations he was too young to fully understand. These verbal assaults, the denial of paternity, the implications about his mother's character, had finally pushed Kento beyond his capacity to endure. He hadn't disappeared because of stranger danger or teenage rebellion. He'd run from the person who should have protected him, choosing homelessness and uncertainty over returning to abuse. As Leia listened to this account, she faced another critical decision. The obvious, legally correct action was to immediately contact police, report finding Kento, and let authorities handle the situation through proper channels. But Leia understood something crucial about how systems work. If she simply turned Kento over to police, he would likely be returned to his father pending investigation. Without documented evidence or corroborating witnesses, a child's accusations against a parent often aren't sufficient for immediate protective intervention. Instead, Leia made a calculated, risky choice. She took Kento to a trusted friend, a fellow Filipina married to a Japanese nurse who understood child protection protocol procedures. They provided Kento with food, warmth, medical assessment, and most importantly, safety while Leia planned her next moves. Over the following days, she worked methodically to build an evidence-based case. She documented Kento's physical injuries with photographs. She helped him write a detailed statement with assistance from a registered social worker, ensuring it would meet legal standards for admissibility. She retrieved the notebook from the park, which served as contemporaneous documentation of his emotional state. Then, formally and officially, Leia filed a report of suspected child abuse with the appropriate authorities under the Jido Fukushiho, the Japanese Child Welfare Act. This law provides mechanisms for protecting children from domestic violence, but implementation requires substantial evidence, particularly when accusations target a parent with no prior criminal record. Mr. Miyazaki presented as exactly the kind of person authorities hesitate to suspect. A quiet manufacturing company employee, no criminal history, no previous complaints, a widower raising his son alone. On paper, he appeared to be a grieving father whose child had disappeared, then been hidden by a foreign teacher who'd manipulated him with false accusations. When Mr. Miyazaki received notification of the abuse allegations, His response was immediate and aggressive. He demanded to see Kento, accused Leia of kidnapping, claimed she'd brainwashed his son with lies, and threatened to file criminal charges against her for child abduction. This counterattack could have been devastating. In Japan's legal system, which values social harmony and treats accusations against families with extreme caution, a foreign national accusing a Japanese citizen of child abuse while simultaneously harboring the child could face serious legal jeopardy. But Leia's methodical approach began paying dividends. The Jido Sodanjo, the child consultation center that investigates such cases, examined Kento independently and found his account credible. 2 additional teachers from Kento's earlier grades came forward with their own observations. Bruises they'd noticed, explanations that hadn't quite made sense, instances of Kento appearing at school without lunch, or arriving extremely early as though avoiding home. As the investigation deepened, authorities uncovered the psychological foundation underlying Mr. Miyazaki's abusive behavior, his genuine belief that Kento wasn't his biological son. This wasn't simply an insult hurled during arguments. It was a conviction that had poisoned his relationship with the child for years. According to Mr. Miyazaki's statements to investigators, he'd long suspected his late wife of infidelity. He believed she'd maintained contact with a former boyfriend, even after their marriage, and that Kento was the product of that relationship. This suspicion had festered, transforming what should have been paternal love into resentment and hostility. When Kento heard these accusations articulated officially during proceedings, the emotional impact was devastating. He'd known his father doubted their relationship, but hearing it stated formally, learning his father had genuinely believed he was raising another man's child, added new layers of pain to his already traumatic experiences. The City Welfare Office, seeking definitive resolution to this central question, recommended DNA paternity testing. This suggestion was both logical and risky. If Mr. Miyazaki's suspicions proved correct, it might provide some context for his behavior, though it certainly wouldn't excuse abuse. If wrong, it would demonstrate that years of mistreatment had been based on paranoid delusion rather than actual betrayal. The testing was conducted at Nihon Genetic Research Laboratories, a respected facility specializing in forensic genetic analysis. Within days, results were available. The testing session, where Mr. Miyazaki would learn whether his decade-long suspicions were justified, must have been extraordinarily tense. As the results were presented, observers noted Mr. Miyazaki's confident demeanor. He appeared certain the test would validate his beliefs, that finally he'd have proof his wife had deceived him, and that the child he'd raised wasn't his responsibility. The actual results shattered that certainty completely. The paternity test showed 99.99% probability that Yokota Miyazaki was Kento's biological father, as definitive a confirmation as genetic testing can provide. There had been no affair, no illegitimate child, no betrayal. Kento was his son in every biological sense. The implications crashed down on Mr. Miyazaki visibly. For years he justified his cruelty through the narrative that he was the wronged party, forced to raise another man's child while his wife had deceived him. Now he confronted the reality that he'd tortured his own son, his flesh and blood, based on unfounded paranoia. Whatever had triggered his initial suspicions, perhaps misinterpreted conversations, coincidental resemblances, or simply jealous insecurity, had been entirely wrong. His wife had been faithful. Kento was his biological child, and he'd spent years inflicting physical and emotional abuse on an innocent boy who'd done nothing except be born into an unfortunate situation. The remorse visible on his face during this revelation couldn't undo the harm. Regret doesn't heal trauma or restore stolen childhood, but it did confirm what Leia had suspected. Beneath the abuse was profound dysfunction rooted in false beliefs rather than malicious intent. The legal proceedings continued regardless of Mr. Miyazaki's newfound understanding of his terrible mistake. The case against Mr. Miyazaki proceeded through Japan's legal system, and ultimately, he was convicted of child endangerment and physical abuse under the country's child welfare law and penal code. The court sentenced him to 4 years' imprisonment, a penalty that some might consider lenient compared to other jurisdictions, but within Japanese legal standards, represented serious accountability for domestic violence. 4 years wouldn't erase the trauma Kento had experienced or restore the childhood stolen from him, but it provided time for the boy to heal in safety, removed the immediate threat, and sent a clear message that child abuse, even by parents, carries legal consequences. Under Japan's child welfare system, Kento was placed in a boys' home, a residential facility specifically designed for children with histories of domestic violence. These institutions provide not just housing but therapeutic support, educational continuity, and gradual reintegration preparation. Kento could receive visitors from an approved list maintained by his counselor, and Leia Santiago was among those granted visitation rights. For Leia, the resolution of Kento's case didn't restore her previous position or erase the suspicion she'd endured. Although her name was officially cleared and her actions recognized as heroic rather than criminal, the experience had fundamentally altered her relationship with the school and community. She chose not to return to her original elementary school. Even with innocence established, the memory of accusations, the colleagues who doubted her, and the institutional failure to protect Kento until his disappearance forced action, all of it made resuming her former role impossible. Instead, she accepted a position at a multicultural education center in Fukushima, where foreign educators were welcomed more openly and cultural diversity was celebrated rather than tolerated. This transition represented both professional advancement and emotional healing, a fresh start where she wouldn't constantly encounter reminders of the crisis. A month after her relocation, Leia received a letter. Written in simple Japanese on plain paper, it came from Kento. Enclosed was a poem he'd composed, titled Sensei, Teacher, acknowledging the role she'd played not just as an educator, but as a protector and advocate when he'd needed one most. 1 year later, when Leia's contract in Japan concluded, she returned to the Philippines, carrying memories that extended far beyond her job description. She'd come to Japan seeking professional development and cultural exchange. She departed, having saved a child's life, and demonstrated that sometimes the most important teaching happens outside classrooms. In the years that followed, Mr. Miyazaki served his sentence and was eventually released. According to later accounts, he genuinely attempted rehabilitation, working to repair his relationship with Kento and compensate for the years of harm he'd inflicted. He repeatedly apologized, sought counseling, and tried to become the father he should have been from the beginning. Kento, possessing the remarkable capacity for forgiveness that children sometimes display, gradually accepted his father back into his life. This reconciliation wasn't immediate or easy, but it reflected Kento's fundamentally kind nature, the quality Leia had recognized years earlier that made her determined to help him. Mr. Miyazaki supported Kento through his education, eventually helping him attend university in Tokyo. The relationship would never be what it might have been without the trauma, but it became functional, even affectionate in its way. This case illuminates fascinating differences in how cultures approach child protection, particularly the unique challenges foreign professionals face when navigating unfamiliar systems while trying to help vulnerable children. Japan's approach to child welfare reflects broader cultural values emphasizing family privacy, social harmony, and reluctance to intervene in domestic matters. The concept of harmony, pervades Japanese social structures, creating hesitancy to disrupt families, even when children may be suffering. Teachers and neighbors might observe warning signs, but avoid reporting them, hoping issues will resolve privately without official intervention. This cultural framework creates particular vulnerability for children like Kento. His bruises, isolation, and behavioral changes were noticed by multiple adults over extended periods. Yet no one took action until his disappearance forced a crisis. The system prioritized family integrity over child safety, a calculation that nearly proved fatal. Leia's outsider status paradoxically became her strength. Unburdened by Japanese cultural conditioning about family privacy, she recognized Kento's situation through a different lens, one informed by Filipino cultural values that emphasize community responsibility for children and more direct intervention when harm is suspected. What Japanese colleagues interpreted as private family matters, she correctly identified as abuse, requiring immediate action. However, her foreign status also made her vulnerable. When accusations emerged, cultural prejudices surfaced quickly. The foreigner who didn't understand Japanese customs, who overstepped boundaries, who perhaps had inappropriate intentions toward a child. Miss Yamada's cold treatment and quick willingness to implicate Leia reflected xenophobia that exists even in internationally minded institutions. The language barrier compounded these challenges. Conducting an independent investigation, navigating legal systems, and advocating for Kento all required Japanese language proficiency. Leia had developed only recently. One mistranslation, one misunderstood cultural nuance could have derailed her efforts or worsened her legal position. Research on child abuse reporting shows that mandatory reporting laws, common in Western countries where teachers must report suspected abuse or face legal consequences, don't exist universally. In Japan, reporting is encouraged, but not legally required, creating situations where educators aware of abuse remain passive, fearing they might be wrong or cause social disruption. Leia's decision to continue investigating, even while under suspicion, demonstrated extraordinary courage. She risked criminal charges, deportation, and permanent damage to her professional reputation. Most people facing similar circumstances would have focused entirely on self-protection, cooperating minimally with authorities while distancing themselves from the situation. Her choice to prioritize Kento's welfare over her own safety reflects what psychologists call moral courage, the willingness to take personal risks to uphold ethical principles. This differs from physical courage. It requires acting on convictions despite social, professional, or legal consequences. The DNA test revelation adds psychological complexity. Mr. Miyazaki's abuse stemmed not from sadistic enjoyment, but from false beliefs about paternity that poisoned his relationship with Kento. This doesn't excuse his behavior, but it contextualizes it within a narrative of suspected betrayal rather than pure malevolence. Research on parental abuse shows that when parents believe children aren't biologically theirs, whether true or false, attachment difficulties and increased risk of mistreatment often follow. Evolutionary psychology suggests humans are hardwired to protect their genetic offspring, making step-parenting or perceived non-biological parenting psychologically complex. Leia Santiago and Kento Miyazaki maintained contact through the years following her return to the Philippines, exchanging emails that documented his progress from traumatized child to confident young adult. These communications provided Leia with something invaluable: confirmation that her intervention had created lasting positive change rather than just temporary relief. In 2023, 5 years after the events that had brought them together under such difficult circumstances, Leia returned to Japan for a visit. Among her priorities was reuniting with Kento, now a university student in Tokyo. A far cry from the frightened 10-year-old she'd found shivering in an abandoned building. Their reunion, by all accounts, was emotional. Kento had grown physically, nearly unrecognizable from the small boy she'd taught. But more importantly, he'd grown psychologically. The fear that had defined him during their initial acquaintance had transformed into confidence. The trauma hadn't disappeared. Such experiences leave permanent marks. But he'd developed resilience, the capacity to integrate painful history into a functional present. For Leia, seeing Kento thriving provided validation that extended beyond professional satisfaction. She'd risked her career, her freedom, and her safety on the conviction that this child needed help. That gamble had paid off in the most meaningful way possible, a saved life that had blossomed into productive adulthood. This case ultimately offers several profound lessons about education, advocacy, and moral courage. The most fundamental is that a teacher's value isn't measured by test scores, curriculum implementation, or administrative accolades. It's measured by impact on students' lives, particularly the most vulnerable students, who need advocates willing to look beyond academic performance to recognize deeper struggles. Leia could have maintained professional distance, focused on her subject matter, and avoided the complications that came with noticing Kento's distress. Many educators make exactly that choice, not from callousness but from self-preservation. Awareness that involvement in students' personal crises carries professional and legal risks. Her willingness to prioritize Kento's welfare over her own safety demonstrates what education should be at its core: a relationship of care that extends beyond classroom walls. She saw a child suffering, recognized that official systems were failing him, and took action, despite knowing it might destroy her career. The cross-cultural dimension adds additional significance. As a foreign teacher in Japan, Leia operated without the cultural fluency, language mastery, or institutional support that native educators would possess. She navigated systems designed for Japanese citizens while facing prejudice and suspicion, magnified by her outsider status. Yet these same disadvantages provided clarity. She wasn't constrained by cultural norms that discouraged intervention in family matters. For Kento, Leia represented something irreplaceable: an adult who believed him, who acted on that belief, and who refused to abandon him despite personal cost. That experience, being valued, protected, and advocated for, likely shaped his development as profoundly as the earlier abuse had damaged it. The poem Kento wrote for Leia, titled Sensei, captured a truth that extends beyond their specific story. Teachers who truly see their students, who recognize not just academic potential but human vulnerability, leave legacies that transcend curricula and classrooms. Leia Santiago came to Japan to teach English. She ended up teaching something more important: that courage, compassion, and conviction can save lives. And sometimes, that's the most valuable lesson of all.